Hello everyone, this is Bob and Threadbare, and welcome back to Threadbare Reviews. Well, I've finally gotten through the last book in the Witcher series, and boy, is it a wild ride. The Lady of the Lake is easily the longest book in the series, and a lot happens in its pages. And just to head off any questions, I'm aware that Sapkowski wrote an 8th book titled Season of Storms to cash in on the video game's popularity, and no, I'm not going to be reading it. It came out years after the original novels, and it takes place during the short story period, so as far as I'm concerned, The Lady of the Lake is the end of the series. Now, let's get on with it. The review. Once again, the story isn't told in strictly linear order, but unlike The Tower of Swallows, it doesn't jump around nearly as much between plotlines. Geralt spends most of his winter in the Duchy of Toussaint, where he takes well-paid jobs for winemakers and enjoys the company of the sorceress Fringilla Vigo. However, at one point he overhears the allies of Vilgefortz mention where his hideout is, and so Geralt and company immediately set off to assault the castle and rescue Yennefer. Vigo informs the Lodge of Sorceresses of where he's going because she was spying on him for them, but they attack the wrong castle because Geralt realized this and lied to her. Meanwhile, Ciri is a prisoner of the NL, a group of elves that left their home dimension and settled in a new one. And in the process, they enslaved the local humanoids and drove off the local unicorns. The elves promise to let Ciri go home if she lets their king Oberon impregnate her, but it's unclear how truthful they're being with her. As it is, King Oberon is too old and too racist to actually have sex with Ciri, and when he tries an aphrodisiac potion given to him by Commander Eredin, the shock to his system is so great that he dies. Fortunately, the sage Avallac'h takes pity on Ciri and lets her escape, and the unicorn she saved back in the Time of Contempt shows her how to use her powers to move between different times, places, and dimensions. She jumps between quite a few of them before she finds Vilgefortz's castle, and in the process she ends up bringing the Black Plague to the Witcher setting. If you remember the characters in the video game talking about the Catriona Plague, that is literally the Black Death from Earth. Also, meanwhile, the Second Nilfgaardian invasion culminates in the Battle of Brenna, which the allied northern kingdoms win, and which it's at least implied that the Lodge of Sorceresses orchestrated. Then there's the big showdown between Vilgefortz, Bonhart, Geralt, and Ciri, and while the two villains only make very small mistakes, it's enough for the two heroes to kill them. After that, Emperor Emhyr shows up and arrests everyone, and it's only now that we discover that Emhyr was Ciri's father Duny this whole time. Emhyr gives Geralt and Yennefer the dignity of letting them kill themselves rather than executing them, but when Ciri starts crying, Emhyr discovers that he can't resist his daughter's tears, and he gives up on his plan of marrying his own daughter. Instead, he marries the fake Ciri, who was presented to him a few months ago, which is still pretty bad. Emhyr was old enough to be Pavetta's father, which means he's old enough to be Ciri, or a Ciri lookalike's, grandfather. Anyway, Geralt, Ciri, and Yennefer start riding around to reward or revenge everything that happened to Ciri back in the earlier novels. But then the Lodge of Sorceresses demand that Ciri go along with their plan to rule the world. Ciri reluctantly accepts, but she asks for a chance to say goodbye to Geralt one last time. They allow her, by a narrow margin, but just before Ciri can meet the Witcher, a pogrom erupts in Rivia, and Geralt gets stabbed through the chest by a peasant when he tries to defend the dwarves. Yennefer exhausts herself trying to heal Geralt, and then the unicorn shows back up to take Geralt and Yennefer to the Isle of Mists, where they shall live in peace forevermore. And for her part, Ciri gets sick of the whole damn world, and so she teleports to Arthurian Britain and never looks back. The end. I've said before that the blood of elves felt like practice compared to the Time of Contempt, and I feel the same way about the Tower of Swallows and the Lady of the Lake. Sapkowski continues to use flash-forwards and historical asides like he used in Swallows, and while maybe I'm just used to them by now, I think he handles this aspect a lot better in The Lady of the Lake. Instead of having nested framing devices and competing historical perspectives and split-up main stories, everything is much more compartmentalized. When the book focuses on Geralt, it sticks with him until he leaves Toussaint. When the book focuses on Ciri, it sticks with her until she leaves the NL world. When the book focuses on the Battle of Brenna, it jumps between a number of perspectives, but it sticks with the battle until it ends. I find this approach much better than the way the Tower of Swallows handles things. I should also say that I'm impressed with the fact that Sapkowski foreshadowed future events in earlier books and managed to incorporate them into the ending. I could name a few famous authors who have also tried writing the ending first, and who have struggled to follow through because the story got away from them. The reason I think Sapkowski got away with it is because he was never very specific about what future events would take place. We know that the spymaster Dijkstra will be attacked by assassins and get away, but it's not until this book that we find out who sent them, why, and what he does afterwards. Incidentally, he doesn't go to Novigrad to become a crime lord. He actually heads east to the unknown lands across the mountains. There is one minor retcon, but it's one that I appreciate. One of the characters in the flash-forwards mentions Dandelion's book, and in the course of the novel, he loses his original manuscript, which means whoever died next to it wasn't him, and his autobiography isn't lost to history. The most interesting thing about the novel, at least in my opinion, is the ending. Geralt is fatally wounded, and the reason he's wounded is because he makes a tiny mistake at the wrong moment, which is also why the two villains die. And after that, the novel becomes very storybook, very mythological. Geralt being sent off on a boat to a magical island as he lays dying is a direct reference to King Arthur's fate. And as you can guess from the book's title and Ciri ending up in Arthurian Britain, that reference is very deliberate. So, biggest question. Is it all worth the trouble? Honestly, I'd say it is. There are absolutely some rough patches in the Witcher saga, but The Lady of the Lake is the best written of the whole series. You can really see all of the experience that Sapkowski gets from writing the series pay off in this last installment. And so, while some of the books might be better off read as summaries or recaps, The Lady of the Lake is, at least on its own merits, well worth the effort. The analysis. Much like the last book, one of the main themes of The Lady of the Lake is historical perspective. The actions of a moment can change history. A series of decisions can end a war, and yet at the same time, the wheels of society will keep turning, and destiny cannot be denied. Nilfgaard loses the War of Expansion, but they increase their economic dominance since the war decimated northern territories. Time and time again, Ciri ends up in someone's clutches, but every time something happens and she slips through their fingers. Everyone thinks that Ciri is destined to give birth to a child who will save the world from the White Frost, and everyone thinks that they're the ones who are going to get that child. And yet in the end, Ciri has no children, leaves the world behind, and the Ice Age continues its inevitable expansion. Mythology is another big theme. One of the big flash-forwards is to a pair of women who are using magic to fill in the details left by the historical record, the stories, the legends, and the myths surrounding Geralt and Ciri. They have some first-hand accounts like Dandelion's book, but Dandelion wasn't there for the whole thing, and he's not exactly a reliable narrator. Then there are paintings, illustrations, retellings, and all sorts of other documents that dilute the truth. For that matter, the two women got hooked on Geralt's story because they read the sanitized version for children, and only when they grew up did they learn all about the ugly details. You also see some of this when a different flash-forward is discussing the history of the Lodge of Sorceresses. Several of the sorceresses are referred to as holy martyrs, which implies a few things about what happened to them. Firstly, that they die because of political and religious machinations. Second, that their secular society gets religious backing at some point. And third, that their side, that their religion, wins, to the point that they can teach kids that those who died in the early days were holy martyrs and not evil witches. And yet, there's also a certain amount of mythology that happens even in the moment. When Ciri practices her power, she jumps between dozens of times and places, and several of her appearances leave lasting impressions on people who grow up to be painters and historians. When Emhyr comes to kill Geralt, his heart really is moved by the tears of a child. And of course there's the whole thing with Geralt getting the King Arthur send-off just before Ciri leaves her reality and goes to meet King Arthur in person. Mythology is the stories we tell each other to understand and enjoy the world around us. And while a lot of it is made up, sometimes reality lives up to the standards of a story, and no lies or exaggerations are needed. Thanks for joining me again for today's Threadbare review, and I hope I'll see you next time. Until then, please remember to like, share, and subscribe, and if you have a little extra money to spare, you can support me on Patreon. Link in the description.